Well, it is 6 months since the war began in Ukraine. It's also Independence Day in Ukraine. We were speaking to Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO chief, and this is what he's been saying to us.
We are fundamentally doing two things. We are providing support to Ukraine to help them uphold the right for self-defense against the brutal aggression of Russia. And the other thing NATO is doing is to prevent this war from escalating beyond Ukraine. NATO and NATO allies are not part of the conflict, and we have increased the military presence, especially in the eastern part of the alliance, to send a very clear message to Moscow that if any NATO ally is attacked, the whole alliance will respond, and UK is playing an important part in those efforts.
Does that mean we are putting ourselves on a war footing?
It means that we are supporting Ukraine in their defensive war against the Russian aggression, and then it means that we are doing what we can to prevent the war from escalating to directly involve NATO-allied countries. And we do that in the way we have actually preserved peace for more than 70 years as NATO. By having credible deterrence and defense, telling Moscow clearly that all allies will protect and defend an ally which is under attack. So that's the way NATO preserves peace, and it's even more important now.
Spending targets for NATO members is at least 2%. That's the hope, that's the ambition. During the Cold War, Britain's spending rose to almost 8% of GDP. Are we entering, potentially from what you're saying, a sort of Cold War readiness where we are going to have to look as member countries at spending more to keep our people safe?
We need to spend more on defense. And I have been a politician myself for many, many years. And I know that, of course, it is always more tempting to spend on healthcare, on education, on infrastructure, instead of spending on defense. But when we live in a more dangerous world, when we see the aggressive actions of President Putin against a sovereign, peaceful nation in Europe, Ukraine, and all the threatening rhetoric against NATO allies, then we need to invest more. And that's exactly what NATO allies are doing. The UK already spends more than 2%, but we need to do more together. And we need to invest in new and more modern capabilities to ensure that we are able to also protect all allies in the future.
Liz Truss, who may well be our next Prime Minister, I'm sure you're aware of that, is suggesting 3% of GDP here in the UK by 2030. Do you think that would be enough, or given what we're looking at and the situation in Europe at the moment, we could find ourselves in having to invest even more as a percentage than that?
The NATO guideline is 2% of GDP, and my focus now is to ensure that all allies meet that guideline. The good news is that more and more allies actually spend 2% or more on defense, and those who are not yet at 2% have, most of them, clear plans in place to reach 2%. Then 2% is a minimum, so of course we welcome UK and others which are aiming at a higher level of spending than 2%, because the brutal reality is that faced with Russia's military buildup, the will to use force against the neighbors, there is a need to invest more in defense.
What about deliberate damage to a civil nuclear reactor in Ukraine, which potentially could send a plume of radiation westwards to NATO countries? What would NATO do then?
That's a very dangerous situation, and it can, of course, also affect people in NATO-allied countries. But it's a different thing than an armed attack on a NATO-allied country. The situation in around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, is dangerous, and it's reckless of Russia to deploy forces to use the area around the nuclear power plant as a launching pad for artillery for attacks on Ukrainian forces. So therefore, we need the International Atomic Energy agency to have access to be able to inspect the site. We need the Russians to move their forces away from the nuclear power plant, and we need the Ukrainian operators to be able to do their work in a peaceful and controlled environment, because what Russia does around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is dangerous, and it's dangerous for not only Ukraine but also for the whole of Europe.
Between Brexit and talks of other European countries, Hungary, Sweden, Italy, leaving the EU, and the NATO withdrawal of Afghanistan this time last year, which do you think emboldened Putin the most to exploit, I should say, Europe's perceived weakness and disunity and invade Ukraine?
Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014. Then he illegally annexed a big part of Ukraine, Crimea, and he started to move forces and to support the separatists in the eastern part of Donbass. So Russian aggression against Ukraine didn't start in February this year. It started 8 years ago. Then, of course, what you saw this year was a full-fledged invasion. And that was invasion they have planned for many months. NATO allies actually predicted the invasion. So I think it's no way to try to speculate whether this is linked to Afghanistan or any other thing. The reality is that Putin has an ambition, and this is an ambition that he's had for a long time, to re-establish some kind of sphere of influence where he can control neighbors, and in particular Ukraine and other countries in his close neighborhood.
But do you acknowledge that he is taking the opportunity to exploit European disunity?
What we see, and therefore we need to understand that Ukraine is a highly valued partner of NATO. We provide support to Ukraine, but Ukraine is not a NATO ally. So the same security guarantees that applies for all NATO allies, United Kingdom, for all other allies, they don't apply for Ukraine. What we have done for Ukraine is that we have supported them, and again, United Kingdom has been part of that, especially since 2014, with more equipment, more training, and that's the reason why the Ukrainian armed forces are much stronger, much more capable now than in 2014, and why they have been able to fight back, to stand up against Russia's brutal invasion and actually retake some territory, and also fight back so the Russian offensive, for instance, in Donbass has stalled. So that's our main purpose. My main task is to continue to provide support to Ukraine.
But if I may, sir, I mean, you talk about it not being a NATO member, Ukraine. Neither was Afghanistan, neither was Bosnia, neither was Kosovo, and yet we sent troops there. Does NATO regret not answering the call quicker from Ukraine when they said the writing is on the wall, we need your help on the ground now?
Well, actually, we stepped up in 2014, and we have done a lot since then, NATO and NATO allies. And actually, it was NATO and NATO allies that warned clearly against the invasion many months ago, and we predicted very exactly the invasion and the playbook for the war, the aim of Russia to try to take Kyiv, and we have no indication that Russia has changed its ambition when it comes to controlling Ukraine. But it is exactly the support from United Kingdom, from all the NATO allies, that has enabled, at least helped to enable the Ukrainian forces to stand up against the invasion. And President Putin made a big strategic mistake when he invaded Ukraine. He thought it could take control of Ukraine within days. Now Russia has waged war against Ukraine for 6 more months, and what we see is a war of attrition, where Russia is taking a lot of casualties because of the courage and the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian political leadership.
You've mentioned 2014 and the invasion, the annexation of Crimea a couple of times there. Should NATO support Ukraine's endeavour to recapture it?
We should support Ukraine in the right to defend themselves, a right which is enshrined in the UN Charter. NATO is not part of the conflict, but we support Ukraine. Then it's for Ukraine to decide. This war will most likely end at the negotiating table. President Zelensky has stated that clearly. But we know that what Ukraine can achieve on the negotiating table is totally dependent on the strength on the battlefield. And therefore, the best way we can ensure that the negotiations lead to a result which is acceptable for Ukraine is to provide military, economic, financial, humanitarian support to Ukraine now.
So are you suggesting that potentially President Zelensky should be in a position where he has to compromise on sovereign territory that has already been annexed by Russia?
It's for Ukraine to decide. Our responsibility is to support them as much as we can with more support, with faster support. And I engage directly with political leaders throughout the alliance to speed up delivery of military support. And then President Zelensky, the Ukrainian people, have to make the final decisions on negotiations and what kind of agreement they are ready to go into. But the aim of NATO support, the purpose of NATO support, is to ensure that Ukraine can prevail as an independent sovereign state in Europe. We have to understand that the easiest way to end this war is for President Putin to stop fighting, to stop attacking. If President Putin stops fighting, we will have peace. If Zelensky, Ukraine, stops fighting today, then Ukraine will cease to exist as an independent sovereign nation. So therefore, we need more military support to Ukraine. That's my message.
OK, but just to clarify, are you saying that if President Zelensky says this war is not over until Crimea and the Donbass region of Ukraine is taken back into Ukrainian sovereign control, if he says not until that has happened is this war over, that is something that NATO would support?
We will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will support Ukraine to prevail as an independent sovereign state in Europe. And then this war will most likely end at the negotiating table. And the outcome of that will totally depend on the strength on the battlefield. That's the reason why we support them.